As we continue to talk about the Renaissance, we want to mention today about the new way of thinking that was going on in Europe here in this 1300s to early 1600s time period. Change is our key word here. That is our main idea. And understand that new ideas were being introduced and just blended into this European society. And that's kind of the way it goes today, isn't it? As new ideas come into a society, very rarely do they take on the same exact form as they had in their previous locations. Usually cultures will cultivate those ideas and change them a little bit. Here in the United States, we often say Americanize them and then move forward. So when you have a highly religious society, as the Middle Ages had been, introduced to these somewhat secular ideas coming from the ancient Greeks and Romans, it's going to not only bring some new flavor, but also maybe even some trouble when you talk about getting along and moving forward. All right, let's talk first about this concept known as humanism. Humanism is an intellectual movement, it says in your notes, in the period. It focuses mainly on human potential. This is the looking at the events of humanity through things like history. They're not trying to make the classical texts agree, it says, with the Christian teachers. Remember scholasticism with Thomas Aquinas? He was trying to find a way to reason out Christian literature, Christian ideas and doctrines with classical ideas. Instead, humanism is just trying to understand the values that are being introduced there. You're going to popularize, the notes say, by studying some classical education, history, literature, philosophy, and today we still call these the humanities. They felt that they could enjoy the world without offending God, kind of having the best of both worlds. You could, and you've got a lot of things you could do there: music, art, fine foods, and this is where the money makers, particularly those middle class merchants, really became patrons of the arts, and they're going to fund much of the great work that's going to be produced in this time period. Many remained devout Catholics. Again, they did not shun their religion. Instead, the spirit of that faith was becoming increasingly secular. Even officials in the church were doing more and more, perhaps outside the spiritual authority that they held. They were committed to the religion, let's say, but not necessarily the doctrine of the faith. New gender roles were popping up and being recognized here for both men and women. Men were expected to be, particularly those in the upper echelons of the society, expected to be educated, being a master of more than one area of study, so you weren't just good at one thing. Charming, witty, educated, all that good stuff. Kind of like me, right? Keep that to yourself. Then, of course, Renaissance women were also expected to know the classics and be charming and all that stuff, but should not seek fame. They should not try to promote themselves for notoriety. They had very little influence, still continued, except for a few rare occasions, in power in society. Art is going to change. Understand that the subjects continue to be very religious. However, the models of these religious icons tended to look a lot like the Greek and Roman art productions here. There's an example of that blending between the Greco-Roman culture and that of Christian Europe. This would be a time period where realism is going to dominate. If you compare the Middle Ages art to that of the Renaissance, it looks a lot more realistic, revealing distinctive features about people. It showed you for exactly what you were, not necessarily idealistic, not perfect, but for exactly what you were. Several notable artists that we will mention, they're listed here in your notes. Michelangelo, realistically portraying the human body in works like the Sistine Chapel, as well as sculpting figures like David. David was a pretty popular figure for sculptors to take on. In fact, Donatello, very famous for his depiction of David. He is another realistically sculpting artist of the time period. Raphael, great painter, who at a very young age became somewhat of a master during the time. His work, The School of Athens, very famous as it supposedly congregated all the great thinkers and minds of that previous Greco-Roman culture of academic learning. Leonardo da Vinci, here's our poster child for the Renaissance. He is the Renaissance man, very good at so many different things, from art to music to inventing. The list goes on. But there were a few women, and I'm going to probably pronounce these wrong. Anguillisa was very famous for her portraits, and Gentileschi was very famous for painting very strong, heroic women in her features there. Writing, we've already talked about. Following the lead of Dante, many writers began producing work in the vernacular, the language of their people. Petrarch, influential humanist, would be a poet of the day. Boccaccio, his Decameron, was a comic view of life, definitely showing that people were individuals and definitely they were bound to make mistakes. And then, of course, probably the greatest work of the era, from our perspective, from a power analysis, would be Machiavelli's The Prince. This was a guidebook, how to keep power, and it definitely showed the difference between what had previously been seen, perhaps during the Middle Ages, that realm of power, to the current corruption, as well as whatever you got to do to get power, whatever you got to do to keep power. And Victoria Colonna, the woman poet, would share sonnets with Michelangelo and would write about a lot of personal subjects. Your notes tells you there. The Renaissance would move north, following money and safety, as Italy became more and more dangerous. You got something good going on, more people want to control it, so wars that would dominate Italy would make it not a safe place, and the money and trade were also moving north, so the poets and the writers and the artists would travel and follow that. Population was growing, it said again, by the late 1400s in Europe. The 100 Years' War was over, so it was a perfect storm, really, or a good time, a good environment for this movement to move north. So more blending, because of course the northern European cultures were different from the southern European cultures. A couple of neat artists here listed. Let's just focus on Jan van Eyck, his introduction of the oil-based paints. Going to allow for a lot more detail. Oil-based paints takes a lot longer to dry, and if you look at some of his work, you can see just some fantastic intricacies there that are available. Writers, people like Sir Thomas More, seeing the church's failure to take people to inspirational levels and being critical of that. It's going to write, of course, Utopia. And then probably one of the famous writers of the English language, Shakespeare, is going to dominate what we'll call the Elizabethan age with his not only playwright and drama productions, but also his poetry. All of this is going to be aided by the fact that German Johann Gutenberg, producing the printing press, 1455, is going to make books more available. So, as you would imagine, literacy rates will probably rise. So, finishing up the changes of the time, arts will change with new styles and new techniques, new images of beauty, and then, of course, society, as new access to information comes into play, there's going to be new players questing that power. Thanks a lot.